Thanks for being here. I want to begin tonight by going to a statement that Paul made over in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 in verse 20. Now, this statement comes sort of in the middle of a discussion that he's having about spiritual gifts. And I'm not going to go into all the detail about these spiritual gifts, but he's dealing with mentioning how prophecy is the gift that they should desire. They wanted all to be able to speak in tongues, and there was division in the church because of their misunderstandings about the spiritual gifts. But prophecy was the means by which an understanding of God's purposes was revealed. Seems to be pretty important, right? To be able to understand the knowledge of God and the effect that has on our thinking. And right in the middle of that discussion, he says in verse 20, "Brothers, do not be children in your thinking. Be infants in evil, but in your thinking be mature." In my mind, this is just a classic statement of Paul. It's a great phrase, and he draws on, I think, some other statements that are similar to this. Maybe your mind goes back, at least mine does, to Jesus talking about how we need to be as wise as serpents, yet harmless as doves. I think there's hints of that in this text. Don't be children in your thinking. Don't be childish in your thinking, but be mature. Well, how can we be mature in our thinking? Well, it gets back to the way in which we come to understand the knowledge of God that has been revealed to us. Tonight, for a few minutes, I want to talk about becoming mature in our thinking. And I want to draw some contrasts between childish thinking and mature thinking. So to begin with, we'll talk about childish thinking. There was a lot of childish thinking that was going on with the Christians at Corinth. And that had created a whole number of problems there. Many that you probably remember from that letter. But childish thinking is not just a problem associated with children. It's a problem that as adults we have. And those problems are only compounded when we don't allow the gospel to shape and to form our thinking. So let's talk about becoming mature in our thinking. Some traits of childish thinking. How would you describe thinking that is childish? There's probably a list of traits that you could put together. Traits of childish thinking. Children are conceited. Children are conceited. Maybe we could refine it a little bit, and teenagers are conceited in their thinking, right? They think they know everything. They think they know it all. They think they know what's best. When in fact, that's often not the case at all. But here, as adults, as Christians, we can become conceited in our thinking, that we know what's best. Well, if what I think is best conflicts with what God has to say about a particular issue, then there's a problem. There's a problem. If I'm conceited in my thinking, I'm going to do some things that are going to have some negative consequences in my life, in my relationship to God. In Proverbs chapter 26, in verse 12, Solomon says, "Do you see a man who's wise in his own eyes?" Do you see a man who's wise in his own eyes? I should have counted. Maybe you can do this week. How many times in Proverbs that phrase, wise in your own eyes? It's all over Proverbs, that phrase. Do you know somebody who's wise in their own eyes? There's some traits and characteristics that you probably think of. It says, "Do you see a man who's wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him." Somebody who's wise in their own eyes, they're dismissive of other people. They don't care what other people have to say about something. They don't care about wise advice or counsel. They've got it all figured out. And that's what Solomon in so many of those Proverbs warns against. Spiritually speaking, this is a human problem. This is being conceited in thought is a human problem. It gets to the issue of pride. We think we know better than God. That's childish. That's childish behavior, childish thinking that the Bible warns against. Another trait of childish thinking is gullibility. Are you gullible? Nobody who's gullible realizes they're gullible. Somebody who's gullible is liable to believe anything. They're liable to believe anything. They are easily persuaded. Someone who's gullible is liable to get hurt. They will get hurt. And so the gospel, the knowledge of God, the wisdom of God is given to bring stability, to give us a foundation, to give us a standard to judge information against. In Ephesians chapter 4, in verse 14, this is part of a lengthier paragraph here where Paul is writing about the function of God's grace that's been given to us and how it's to be used to, bring us to manhood. That's the word that's used in the paragraph. And he contrasts manhood with children. In verse 14, he says that he doesn't want them to be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. When you think of maturity, you don't think of a child. You think of somebody who's full grown, who has a solid foundation, who has a very clear vision about purpose and what they need to do to accomplish that purpose. Another trait of childish thinking is that it's short-sighted. It's short-sighted. Well, what are the consequences of that decision? I don't know. Does it matter? Here's what I want to do. This is what I want to do. This is how I want to do it, and I want to do it right now. Well, what about tomorrow? We're not thinking about tomorrow. We're not thinking about the effect that something's going to have in my life or in the lives of the people around me. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 25, the writer commends the faith of Moses and remembers how he chose to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Moses was not short-sighted in his thinking, was he? He recognized the sacrifice that he was going to have to make by leaving the household of Pharaoh. I mean, he could see the treatment of the slaves in Egypt every day all around him. He knew what that life was like, what it looked like, what it sounded like, the hardship of it. He decided, that's what I'm going to choose. I'm going to give up all of the comforts of Pharaoh's house because I can see that God has a bigger purpose in mind. I can see that God is bringing a greater blessing than anything Pharaoh could give to me. Sin is deceitful. Sin doesn't want us to see beyond the present. Lastly, a trait of childish thinking is that it's just worldly. It's just worldly. Being consumed exclusively with the here and now. No concern whatsoever for the spiritual life, for the spiritual realm. You know, we live in a very unique time for a lot of different reasons. And one of the reasons why it's such a unique time in which we live is that we live in a society that has dismissed the spiritual realm. It has dismissed spiritual life. If you go back throughout the history of humanity, you won't find that. You'll find people who were keenly aware that there was more to this world, more to this life than what you could see in front of you. For all of the shortcomings and problems with pagans, with idolaters, they were cognizant of a spiritual life. Our society says, no, this is all there is. So enjoy it for all it's worth, because it's all there is. How does that kind of thinking affect how a person lives their life? How does that kind of thinking affect how a person gets up and goes to work every day? What kind of employer is that kind of person? That kind of thinking produces someone who is greedy, who has no ethics, who's just set on what he can get, regardless of who he's got to run over or what he's got to do to get it. How does worldly thinking affect family life? Now, why do you think so many couples in midlife break their families up and divorce? Well, if this is all there is, then I want something better than what I've got, and so break up our marriages, break up our families. Kids are resilient, you know. I want to be happy. That's worldly. That's worldly. There is a contrast. There is a stark contrast that is made in the Scriptures about being worldly minded and spiritually minded. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1, part of the problem with the Christians in Corinth was that they were worldly in their thinking. He says, brothers, I could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. Worldliness is a trait of childish thinking. Now, if you want more information about the contrast between being spiritually minded and worldly minded, read the first 11 verses of Romans 8. Being spiritually minded and worldly minded are about lifestyles. Very different lifestyles with very different outcomes. Nothing good comes from childish thinking. Childish thinking is selfish, is impulsive, is dangerous, is destructive. So we need to heed the instructions of Paul and not to be childish in our thinking. If we're going to become mature in our thinking, then our minds have to be renewed. They have to be trained. And what this really gets down to in the Scriptures is about reclaiming our thinking to God. Here in Romans chapter 12 in verse 2, he says, do not be conformed to this world. There's more of this idea of worldliness. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. The image that we have in our mind about what a Christian is supposed to be, these image bearers reflecting the glory of God in the world, it is a beautiful image. The only way you get to that, that kind of transformation is by the mind being renewed. And what Paul has pointed out in his letter to the saints at Rome is that the mind is often given over to distorted thinking. There are right and wrong ways of thinking. There are right and wrong ways of thinking. How you think determines, everything about you. It's how you think will determine your values. It will determine your behaviors. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6, it goes right along with the point that Paul makes here. He says how we're supposed to bring our thinking bring our thinking. He says to bring every thought into the submission of Christ. To bring every thought into the submission of Christ. That's how the mind is renewed. The gospel is what brings about this renewal. Because the gospel is all about what God accomplished at the cross. And at the cross is a clear distinction that God makes between good and evil. He puts to death, destroys sin at the cross. And is shown there in the present what He's ultimately going to do in the future. This is how everything ends. It all ends with sin and those who've colluded with the forces of evil being destroyed. And those who have sought their salvation through the resurrected Lord, well, they're exalted. They're exalted. So that should inform our thinking, how we navigate through all of the moral dilemmas of life. In Philippians chapter 4 and verses 8 and 9, he says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and have received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. You see the responsibility of a renewed mind. He's saying, go out here and find things that are just and honorable and lovely and pure. Find them. You can find them. Because the gospel informs what they look like. Produce this kind of thing in the world. Create things that are true and honorable and just and pure and lovely. That's how you reflect the glory of God. Focus your mind. Focus your life on this. The result is that it's a good life. He says the God of peace will be with you. That sounds like a means by which we find stability in the world. Stability in our lives, hope. Hope for the future. So our minds need to be renewed and they need to be trained. And this yields good results. What are the results of mature thinking? Well, the results of mature thinking, again, you could start to make a list of what happens to us individually, what happens to our families, what happens to our churches, what happens to us when we go to school, what happens to us when we go to work, what happens to the goals that we set for ourselves. Everything changes. Everything changes in ways that are beneficial to us, to our spirituality, how we begin to receive a good and better life in the hope of eternal life. First, a result of mature thinking is acceptance. Acceptance. In Romans 12, we noticed verse 2 a minute ago. If you put verses 1 and 2 together, Paul seems to be starting with the result first and then tells us how to get there. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So if you use a little logic here in the text, what happens when we're transformed by the renewing of our mind? What happens is we become accepted by God. Now we spent some time here recently in our study of Hebrews, looking at Hebrews chapter 11, where you have all of these different people who gained God's approval. They pleased God. No greater commentary can be made of anyone than that they pleased God. Now, how do we please God? Well, it's through faith. Faith has to do with believing in who He is and diligently seeking Him. Faith is about living out the life that God has set for us. And in so doing, we're accepted by Him. accepted, welcomed into his family. That acceptance is something that we receive now that has a present consequence, and ultimately is what we anticipate in eternity. Secondly, a result of mature thinking is discernment. Discernment. He says, back here in this text that we started with in 1 Corinthians 14, brothers, do not be children in your thinking, be infants in evil. Be infants in evil, but in your thinking be mature. Be infants in evil. It's kind of an interesting way to make a point, isn't it? You don't want to become mature in evil. Again, we can go back to Genesis 6 and we can see the consequence of when people become mature in evil. God brought judgment upon the world because they had become full grown in evil. Every intention of their heart was set on evil. No, we've got to make discernment between good and evil. That's consequential. That means it makes all the difference. It means everything to us in our lives. In Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14, he says, but solid food is for the mature. This is what we're talking about. Being mature. Solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. If you want to become mature in your thinking, then you have to make use of what you learn of the gospel. You have to make use of what we talk about on a Sunday night. You got to make use of it in your life. Otherwise, it's just lost on you. It's wasted on you. That's what this text is about. You have to decide. You've got to make those judgments. You've got to make those discernments between good and evil. How do you do that? Well, it gets back to this point of renewal and training the mind. He says, your powers of discernment are trained. Our powers of discernment have to do with that organ in between our ears. It's about our mind. Thirdly, a result of mature thinking is wisdom. Wisdom. In Proverbs chapter 14, in verse 16, it says, one who is wise is cautious. One who is wise is cautious and turns away from evil. But a fool is reckless and careless. Wisdom is a very wide and layered topic. We could have an interesting conversation if we just talked about, well, what is wisdom? How would you define wisdom? What makes a person wise? One of what wisdom has to do with, one of the things that wisdom has to do with is about one's ability to anticipate the consequences of a decision. Did you catch that? Wisdom has to do with one's ability to anticipate the consequences of a decision. All of that really comes down to two things. It comes down to two things. It's about thinking, and it's about experience. You can't talk about wisdom without talking about experience, and this is the challenge that is, as parents we have with our children. Our children, they lack experience. It's just reality. We try to impart wisdom to them. Well, what one may lack in experience, they can attempt to compensate for through thinking. Trying to think through the consequence. If I do this, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? How's it going to affect my life? What's it going to do to the people around me? That's how wise people think. They're cautious. And in their thinking, if they realize that there are going to be negative consequences, what I mean by negative consequences are the consequences of a decision are going to hurt me spiritually. They are going to hinder or prevent me altogether from being with God in eternity. If that's what we conclude, then we turn away from that. That's what Proverbs, this text says. A wise man is cautious and turns away from evil. The fool, well, is reckless and careless. Reckless and careless. They don't think like that. They just don't think like that. Proverbs 16 and verse 9, the heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Do you see how the wise man and the Lord are together? The wise man and the Lord are working together in that text. It's a trait of wisdom. And lastly, a result of mature thinking is strength. It's strength. If you and I are going to thrive as Christians in the world, we have to be strong. We have to become strong. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 13 to 16, Peter says, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Christ Jesus. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as He who has called you is holy, and you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.'" Prepare your minds for action. Be sober-minded. Only the mature do that. Only the mature heed the instruction of that text. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. That's what we've been talking about tonight. There might have been a time where you were reckless, where you were thoughtless, where you were impulsive, when you were childish. You're not that way anymore. You've learned better. And in so doing, now you can ready yourself for action. You can respond to the constantly changing circumstances of your life. I don't know what today brought for you. I sure don't know what tomorrow is going to bring for us. But if we become mature in our thinking, as Paul tells us to, we'll be ready for it. We'll be ready for it. I appreciate your time tonight. I hope this lesson would help focus us on how to become mature. We talk a lot about it. The Bible has a great deal to say about becoming mature, growing as Christians, and hopefully this lesson helped put a fine point on the kind of life that we're supposed to be living. If there's someone here tonight whose heart is not right, whose relationship with God is not what it must be to be saved, then you can do something about that. The Lord is ready to receive you if you choose to obey Him tonight. If we can help you be saved, please come forward. Right now, as together we stand and sing.